tenant issues and renter issues are very important in District 6. About 80% of District 6 residents are renters. And so that's, I think, the highest rate of any district in the city.
After the Vietnam War, a lot of people found an entry point in the Tenderloin. And so there's an extremely vibrant Southeast Asian community in the Tenderloin.
It was great to get to know more people down here and realize how many artists and musicians and really creative people live in this area, and that there are families.
I like the semi-industrial character, and because, you know, it's convenient, and I also DJ around here, and I like the clubs and the bars and that sort of thing.
We hope that all three areas complement each other, and that mid-market is not the dividing line between north and south.
Welcome back to District SF on SFG TV. This month we're here in the Asian Art Museum, in the center of San Francisco, and in the center of District 6. It's a large part of the city, District 6, one that many people just drive right through, with their doors locked. But as we'll see, as we go into the Mid-Market, the Tenderloin, and the South of Market, the reality is much different than the reputation. We met District 6's supervisor, Chris Daly, while he was visiting residents of an SRO hotel now managed by the city. The success at the Mission Hotel is one example of halting decades of decline in the very heart of San Francisco. The story of District 6 today is just the most current chapter of Center City's long history.
The districts began in the gold rush and were part pretty much of all of the 19th century. With few exceptions, you've cobbled together, the districts have cobbled together a number of neighborhoods. And so districts largely are pretty much disparate areas. I mean, they take in a whole variety of different kinds of neighborhoods. In District 6, you've got part of the Embarcadero, the old wharf area, which was always a very distinctive part of San Francisco. Then you've got the old Rincon Hill. The hill now is pretty much gone. And so then you have that corridor all the way down from the Embarcadero all the way down into the Mission, which is what we call a mixed-use place. So you got that. You go into the Inner Mission, which is one of the old historic areas of San Francisco as well, centering around Mission Dolores, which was historically in the 19th and early 20th century, a tremendously ethnically mixed area. You had Scandinavians, you had lots of Germans in that area. We forget about that. And then you go into what we call the Tenderloin area. When I was growing up in the city, one of the features of the Tenderloin was it held largely maybe couples or single individuals who worked downtown or worked on the Union Square area. That's obviously now changed.
The Tenderloin has a bad rap in terms of, you know, some folks think that, you know, it's dirty or, you know, it's the intersection of a lot of different social ills. But, you know, I see the Tenderloin as one of the most vibrant neighborhoods in San Francisco in terms of the activity in the Tenderloin, the diversity in the Tenderloin, just the community initiatives and efforts that happen in the Tenderloin, and then a very rich history of the neighborhood and its identity against the backdrop of an encroaching hospitality district and financial district.
Those stereotypes were what were in my mind when I started, when my experience with the Tenderloin started. You know, there were other aspects of it that attracted me to the neighborhood, and that over time I've grown to understand better and appreciate, and those are the sort of more hidden aspects of the neighborhood that I think are really interesting, important, and that people don't really hear about as much. I think the 2004 census found that there are about 30,000 people in the Tenderloin. That's 5% almost 5% of the city's total population. So it's an extremely dense neighborhood. There are a lot of people living in the Tenderloin, and it's primarily a residential neighborhood. It's one of the things that a lot of people may not see. The neighborhood is almost entirely ground floor retail. So as you're walking through or driving through the neighborhood, you see a lot of businesses, storefronts, a lot of which are empty, although that's been improving a lot over the past 10 years. But you see a kind of a commercial neighborhood, and what isn't really seen is that there are 30,000 people living in these about 35 square blocks.
One neat thing that's happened in the Tenderloin over the last couple of decades is the Little Saigon, the development of the Vietnamese community in the western part of the Tenderloin along Larkin Street mainly, where we have increasing numbers of Vietnamese families and small businesses. One of the strengths of the Tenderloin Community School, which was developed, I don't know, 7 years ago, and it's a great school, and there are a lot of kids in the Tenderloin, so that's something that is not thought about.
I think that the neighborhood is constantly improving, but at the same time we're facing a lot of the same issues in the Tenderloin that we have for the past 10 or 15 years or even longer. There was a neighborhood planning study that the Tenderloin 2000 plan that was published in the early 90s, and it laid out 5 basic goals for the neighborhood. And 15 years later, a lot of those goals are still, I think a lot of people would regard them as the primary goals for the neighborhood. They include public safety, affordable housing or housing in general, community economic development, the general environment of the neighborhood, and social services. And I think 15 years later, a lot of those concerns are the same ones that people have now.
New urban social issues do come up in this country, like the rise of crack cocaine, et cetera, in the 80s. But really, other than those sorts of things, there aren't that many new issues in the Tenderloin. It's a very old neighborhood that's been struggling with a lot of issues for a lot of years. St. Anthony's and St. Boniface go back many years. Glide now is an older institution, so there are long-term institutions that are in the Tenderloin that are trying to meet the needs of its residents.
Over the history of the Tenderloin, it's been a place where a lot of service providers have come and provided human services for people who need them. So people with HIV and AIDS, there are resources here for those people. People dealing with substance abuse issues, mental illness. There are a lot of resources in the Tenderloin for those people, and it's a place where people who have special needs such as those can find a home. This is a place where those people can live their lives. There was a time not so long ago when there was a lot of discrimination in housing around people who were HIV or AIDS positive, and so the Tenderloin was a place where a lot of those people could find housing where they would be discriminated against in other parts of the city.
The Tenderloin Neighborhood Development Corporation is a community development corporation which is, I think, the biggest one that we have in San Francisco. They own and have developed and have retrofitted a large number of buildings within the Tenderloin, and their mission is to provide affordable housing to Tenderloin residents. The model of the Community Development Corporation has been very popular for a number of decades here in San Francisco. This is largely a response to the failed redevelopment policies in this city and many other cities across the country back in the 60s and into the early 70s, where there was a top-down approach where cities said, we know better than the neighborhoods, we're going to clear out 4th Street or the Western Addition. And one of the community responses to it is, hey, we can do community redevelopment, and if we come out of the community, we're going to know what the community issues are better than you are as a sort of a top-down bureaucracy. And so there was a rise of these community development corporations, and TNDC, the Tenderloin Neighborhood Development Corporation, is one of the most successful in terms of providing affordable housing units, and usually with better living conditions than the private housing units, to thousands of Tenderloin residents.
Behind us there you can see there are these high-rise hotels that were developed in the early 80s, and the early 80s were this period of intense sort of development pressure on the neighborhood.